The arrivals level at Nashville International Airport has a particular quality at 11:30 at night. The fluorescent lights are the same as they are at noon, but something about the hour makes them feel different, harsher, more honest. The way late-night light tends to strip away the softening that daylight allows. The families waiting for returning travelers stand with the specific posture of people who have been there longer than they expected and are running on the fuel of anticipation rather than comfort. The cab drivers hold their signs. The automatic doors open and close with the patient, mechanical indifference of a system that does not care who is arriving or what they are carrying when they walk through. I had been standing near the arrivals barrier for 22 minutes. The flight from Chicago had landed at 11:04 according to the board, which meant passengers should have been clearing the terminal for the past 15 minutes, which meant my wife was either at baggage claim or had stopped in the restroom, or was walking slowly because she was tired from 4 days of a conference and 2 glasses of wine on the plane, which was what she always did on the way home from conferences. 2 glasses of wine and a crossword puzzle, and the particular, transitional stillness of a woman moving between her professional self and her domestic self, and needing the duration of a flight to make the shift. I had a coffee from the cart near the entrance. It was not good coffee. I drank it anyway because it was something to do with my hands. I was not supposed to be picking her up. She had told me when she left on Tuesday that she would take a car service home, that the conference ran late on the final day, and she did not want me to have to wait up. I had said that was fine. I had meant it. I had fully intended to be asleep when she got home. But at 9:30 that evening, something had shifted in me. Not dramatically, not the way things shift when you know something is wrong. More the way things shift when you have been sitting with a feeling you cannot name for long enough that the feeling decides to name itself. I put on my jacket. I got my keys. I drove to the airport. I had not called to tell her I was coming. I thought it would be a nice surprise. I thought that was the kind of thing a husband did, showed up when he was not expected to, made the arriving easier, made the transition from professional self to domestic self, not a car service and an empty house, but a familiar face and a drive home where nobody had to be anything except 2 people returning to each other after 4 days apart. I thought it would be good. My name is Daniel Holt. I am 43 years old. I was born in Clarksville, Tennessee, the only child of a woman named Miriam who taught English literature at a community college and who had the particular relationship with language that comes from spending your professional life helping other people find the right words, a deep, patient respect for what words can do when they are chosen carefully, and a corresponding sensitivity to what they do when they are not. My father, Gordon, was a civil engineer who worked for the state. He was a quiet man, not unhappy, just economical with his self-expression in the way that some people are, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have decided that most situations do not require the full volume of what they are thinking, and that the appropriate response to most of life is a considered nod rather than a speech. I inherited something from each of them: my mother's sensitivity to language and my father's preference for silence. This combination made me, professionally, a very effective listener, and personally someone who absorbed things rather than expressed them, who processed privately rather than publicly, who held things inside long enough that by the time they emerged, they had been compressed into something very dense and very real. I had been processing something for 3 months, not a specific event. A pattern, the accumulation of small things that individually could be explained and in aggregate could not. The way my wife, Laurel, had been distracted in ways that felt different from the ordinary distraction of a busy professional life. The way certain phone calls were taken in other rooms. The way she had started referring to a colleague named Stephen with a casualness that felt practiced. The way people refer to something they have decided to make sound unimportant. The way she was present in our house without being present in our marriage, physically there and emotionally somewhere else. Somewhere she had not invited me to and had not acknowledged she had gone. I had told myself the story that marriages tell in these seasons, that she was going through something professional, that the firm's restructuring had put her under pressure, that the distance was temporary and would close when the pressure eased, that the right response was patience and the wrong response was accusation. I had been patient for 3 months, and on the evening of the 4th day of her Chicago conference, sitting in our house in Brentwood with a book I was not reading, The patience had exhaled itself and I had put on my jacket and driven to the airport. She came through the arrivals doors at 11:41. She was pulling a small roller bag and wearing the charcoal travel blazer she always wore on the return leg of trips. Practical and presentable and slightly wrinkled in the way of clothes that have been lived in for 4 days. Her hair was down. She looked tired and not unbeautifully so. The specific beauty of a woman who has been working hard in a place she was good at and is returning from the proof of it. She did not see me immediately. She was looking at her phone. I raised my hand to catch her attention and I was about to call her name. And that was when I heard her voice. Not calling to me. Not speaking to anyone in the arrivals hall. She was on her phone. The call was already in progress, had been in progress presumably since before she came through the doors and the automatic doors had opened, and the airport noise had covered the first part of whatever she was saying. And what I heard was the middle of a sentence. The voice she was using was the voice she used when she was not performing anything. The voice for rooms she thought were private. The voice I had been listening to for 11 years, and that I knew in the way you know a sound that has been the background score of your most intimate life. Completely. Without having to think about it. The way you know your own breathing. She said, I cannot keep doing this. Not like this. I'm tired of going home and pretending. She paused. She was listening. She said, I know. I know that. But you have to understand that every time I walk in that door, it costs me something. It costs me more than I can keep paying. Another pause. She said, Stephen, I am exhausted. I just got off the plane. Can we talk tomorrow? She stopped walking. She was 20 feet from me. The arrivals crowd moved around her. She stood still with her phone at her ear, and her roller bag stopped beside her, and her face turned slightly away from me at an angle that meant I could see her profile, but she could not see me. She said, I love you too. She said it the way you say something you have said many times before to someone who needs to hear it again. With the tired, genuine, unself-conscious ease of a person speaking the truth in a room they believe is private. I stood at the arrivals barrier with a cup of bad airport coffee in my hand, and I did not move. I did not call her name. I did not move toward her. I did not do any of the things that I had planned to do when she came through those doors. I watched her end the call. I watched her put the phone in her jacket pocket. I watched her look up and begin scanning the arrivals hall for the exit to the car service pickup, which was where she expected to be going because she did not know I was there. She turned in my direction. She saw me. The moment lasted less than 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, I watched her face do something I had never seen it do before. It did not go guilty. It went calculating. The specific recalibration of a person who has just seen something they were not prepared for, and whose first response is not emotion but strategy. What do I have? What does he have? What did he hear? What do I do with the gap between those two things? It was the calculation that destroyed me, not the words I had heard, not Stephen's name, not I love you too. The calculation, the fraction of a second in which my wife looked at me and thought about the angles before she thought about the truth. She said, Daniel, oh my God, what are you doing here? She said it warmly. She moved toward me and embraced me. And the embrace was real in the physical sense and completely unreal in every other sense, and I held it for exactly as long as I needed to in order to understand what I was holding. I said, I thought I would surprise you. She said, you absolutely did. She was smiling. The smile was the smile she wore in professional contexts when something unexpected had happened, and she was deciding how to respond to it. I had seen it in meetings. I had seen it at dinner parties when someone said something that required careful navigation. I had never seen it directed at me in an airport when I came to pick her up because I missed her and wanted her to come home in a car with me instead of alone. I said, the car is in short-term parking. She said, great. Let me just send a quick message. She took out her phone. She typed something. She put the phone away. She took the handle of her roller bag. She looked at me with the warm, practiced warmth of a woman who was managing a situation and doing it well. She said, I am really glad you came. I looked at her. I said, "Yes." We walked to the car. The drive from Nashville International to Brentwood takes approximately 25 minutes at that hour of the night. Light traffic, the interstate mostly open. The Nashville skyline visible for a few minutes from the bridge before the road bends south and the city disappears behind you. And it is just the highway and the dark on either side and whatever is happening in the car. We talked for 25 minutes. About the conference, about the sessions she had attended and the people she had seen, and the dinner on the third night that had apparently been at a restaurant she had been wanting to try for years and that had exceeded her expectations. About whether our daughter, who was 14 and staying at my mother's for the week, had been keeping her phone charged. About whether I had remembered to water the plants in the kitchen window. We talked for 25 minutes, and not one sentence of it was real. I know that sounds like an overstatement. I know that conversations about restaurants and plants and phone charging can be real. But they were not real in our car on that drive because the conversation was filling a space that should have been filled with something else. And both of us knew it was filling that space, and only one of us knew why. She was performing normalcy. I was performing not knowing. We were two people in a car having a conversation that was entirely constructed around a lie, and the skill with which we both maintained it was the most devastating evidence of how far we had come from whatever we used to be. I pulled into our driveway at 12:17. She got out. She pulled her bag from the trunk. She looked at the house. Our house, the one we had chosen together and moved into and painted and furnished and raised our daughter in, and that had the hydrangeas along the front walk that I had planted, and the porch light that I had replaced twice because the motion sensor kept failing, and that was on now, casting its patient yellow light onto the front steps. She said, "It is good to be home." I looked at the house. I said yes. We went inside. She went upstairs to shower. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the surface of it, and let the 25 minutes in the car expand inside me, until it filled every room of the house, and every year of the 11 we had spent in it, and every conversation we had ever had in this kitchen at this table. And I sat with all of it for as long as it took to understand that I was not going to pretend I had not heard what I heard. Not because I was impulsive, because I was my father's son, a man who processed quietly and completely and who, when he had finished processing, did not require additional information to know what was true. I knew what was true. She came downstairs 40 minutes later in pajamas with her hair damp and a mug of tea she had made herself, the chamomile she always drank when she needed to come down from the heightened alertness of a travel day. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at me with the specific attentiveness of a woman who was watching for something. She was watching for whether I knew. I looked at her for a long moment. I let the silence be exactly as large as it was. Then I said, "I heard you on the phone." She went very still. I said, "At the airport, before you saw me. I heard you tell him you loved him." The kitchen held the silence. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove ticked. The porch light outside was still on, casting its patient yellow through the kitchen window onto the floor between us. She did not deny it. That was the thing I had not expected, and the thing I think about most when I think about that night. She did not tell me I had misheard. She did not tell me it was not what it sounded like. She did not deploy any of the defenses that would have extended the conversation into territory that required me to prove something I already knew. She set the mug down. She looked at the table. She said, "How long have you been standing there?" I said, "Long enough." She closed her eyes. She kept them closed for a moment. Then she opened them and looked at me with the expression I had been watching her manage in airports and cars and kitchens for 3 months, except that the management was gone now. What was underneath it was not guilt exactly. It was grief. The grief of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has just been relieved of it without choosing to set it down. She said, "I did not want you to find out this way." I said, "I know. You wanted to control the timing. You wanted to decide when and how and what version of the truth I received." She said, "That is not fair." I said, "No, it is not. None of this is fair." We sat in the kitchen for 2 hours. I will not detail every word because some words belong only to the people who said them, and some rooms deserve privacy even after the marriage they housed has ended. What I will tell you is that the conversation was honest, more honest in 2 hours at a kitchen table at 1 a.m. than we had been with each other in a very long time. She told me how long. 8 months. She told me it had begun as a friendship and had become something she had not intended and had not been able to stop once it started, and that she had been trying to find the right moment to tell me, and the right moment had kept not arriving. I told her that the right moment not arriving was not a structural problem, but a choice, that every day she came home and went through the motions of our marriage was a day she chose the delay over the truth, that I was the only person in our household who had not been making choices about my own life because I had not been given the information I needed to make them. She said, "I know." I said, "I need you to understand what you took from me. Not the marriage, not the future, the time. You took 11 months of my life in which I was operating on false information and making decisions, small ones and large ones, based on a reality that was not real. Every dinner I cooked thinking we were working through a difficult season. Every night I lay next to you and told myself patience was the right response. Every conversation I had with myself about how to be a better husband to a woman who was somewhere else entirely. You took all of that time and you took the version of me that spent it faithfully, and I cannot get any of it back." She wept, not performatively, the quiet, complete weeping of a woman who has heard something true that she cannot argue with. I did not comfort her. I want to be honest about that. I sat across the table and I watched her cry. And I did not reach across to her because the reaching would have been dishonest, and she had had enough dishonesty for one marriage, and the least I could offer her was the truth of what my hands were choosing to do, which was to remain on the table in front of me, still and present and not performing anything. At 3 a.m. I said, "I think you should stay in the guest room tonight." She said, "All right." I said, "We will figure out the rest in the morning." She picked up her mug. She walked to the doorway. She stopped. She said, "Daniel, I am sorry. I know that does not fix anything, but I need you to know that I am genuinely sorry." I looked at her. I said, "I believe you." She went upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table until the light outside the kitchen window changed from dark to the particular pre-dawn gray that precedes sunrise. Then I made coffee and I sat with it and I thought about my mother in language and my father in silence, and the 11 years of a marriage that was built on two people who were genuinely right for each other in the beginning, and who had, over time and through accumulation and through the particular neglect that is not cruelty, but is still damage, become strangers in a house that had once been a home. Let me tell you about the months that followed the airport, not in a summary, in the specific detail that those months deserve. Because what happened in them was not just the dissolution of a marriage, but the reconstruction of a person, and reconstructions deserve attention. I retained an attorney named Franklin Cross, who practiced family law from an office in the West End, and who had a reputation for clarity in proceedings that tend toward the opposite. Franklin was methodical and unhurried, and had the particular patience of a man who had spent 3 decades watching people in the worst moments of their lives, and who had learned that the most useful thing he could offer was not urgency, but steadiness. I told Franklin everything: the airport, the 2 hours in the kitchen, the 8 months I had not known about, the 11 years before that, the real ones, the ones that had been what I believed they were. Franklin listened. He asked 8 questions. He made his notes. At the end he said, "I want to ask you something that is not about the legal proceeding. It is about you." I said, "All right." He said, "What do you want?" "Not from the settlement. From what comes next. Do you want to recover the marriage or do you want to recover yourself?" I sat with the question. Then I said, "I want to recover myself." The marriage was built on a version of reality that has not existed for at least 8 months and possibly longer. I cannot rebuild something on a foundation that I now know was not what I believed it was. He said, "Then that is what we are going to help you do." The divorce proceedings took 9 months. They were not contentious in the dramatic sense. Laurel did not contest the terms that Franklin proposed. She was represented by an attorney who was professional and measured and who, I believe, had advised her that given the circumstances, the most dignified path was straightforward honesty about the estate and a fair division of what we had built together. What we had built together was not insignificant. The house in Brentwood, purchased in 2015, had appreciated considerably. The joint investment accounts held enough to require careful attention. There were retirement accounts and insurance policies, and the ordinary financial architecture of two working professionals who had been building a shared life with the reasonable expectation that it would continue. But there was also something that Laurel's attorney had not initially accounted for. And this is the part of the story that I tell carefully, not because it is complicated, but because it is the part that required the most honesty about who I actually was and what I had actually been doing in the years of the marriage. I had left my position at the corporate law firm where I had worked for 9 years in 2019. Laurel had understood this as the transition to independent practice that I described to her. This was true in the way that true things are sometimes incomplete. What I had not fully communicated, not because I was hiding it, but because I was the kind of person who built things without requiring an audience for the building, was the specific scale and nature of what the independent practice had become. I had been working in intellectual property and technology licensing. My clients were primarily technology companies that needed legal strategy around their most valuable assets, the patents and licensing arrangements and proprietary frameworks that determined their competitive position. It was work that required the specific combination of legal expertise and business understanding that I had spent 20 years developing at the firm, and it was work that, conducted independently with the client relationships I had built over those 20 years, generated considerably more than my firm's salary had. By the time of the airport night, Ridge Legal Consulting, the entity through which I operated my independent practice, had been generating approximately $1.8 million annually for 3 years. The practice had 7 institutional clients. All 7 had signed contracts that were current and renewing. The practice had no overhead beyond my time and a small administrative relationship with a legal assistant I had worked with for 6 years. Laurel had known I had left the firm. She had understood the independent practice was going well. She had not asked specific questions about what going well meant in financial terms, partly because money was not the axis of tension in our marriage and partly because her own professional life had been absorbing, and she had trusted that I was managing mine. The trust had been warranted. The practice was being managed very well. She just had not known the specific dimensions of what she was trusting me with. Franklin had reviewed the Ridge Legal Consulting documentation within the first 2 weeks of the proceedings. He had reviewed the client contracts, the revenue history, the separate business account in which the practice income was held, and the investment portfolio into which I had been deploying the excess income for 3 years under the management of a financial advisor in downtown Nashville named Ruth Alcott, who had, over that same period, built the portfolio to approximately $4.7 million. Franklin had set down his pen after reviewing the summary and said, "I want to make sure I understand the complete picture before we produce anything to the other side." I said, "I will answer any question you have." He said, "The practice revenue. Did your wife know the specific numbers?" I said, "She knew the practice was doing well. She did not know the specific numbers because I did not know how to have that conversation at a time when our marriage was already under strain. I did not hide it from her intentionally. I simply did not find the moment to make it specific." He looked at me. He said, "I believe you. I also want you to understand that the other side is going to have questions about the timing of the separate accounts and the investment structure." I said, "I understand. Everything is documented. The separate property documentation is clear. The practice predates the marriage difficulty by 2 years. The investment strategy was established by Ruth Alcott in 2020, using income that is documented as practice revenue. There is no marital capital in the portfolio." He said, "Then we are going to present it completely and let the documentation make the argument." The documentation did make the argument, clearly and completely and without the kind of ambiguity that invites interpretation. The Ridge Legal Consulting revenue was separate practice income generated through my independent professional labor. The portfolio was built from that income through documented investment decisions. Tennessee law was clear on the separation of professional income from marital assets under the circumstances, and our documentation was, as Franklin described to the mediator, the most organized presentation of separate property he had submitted in his career. The mediation took place on a March morning in a neutral law office on Broadway. Laurel was there with her attorney. I was there with Franklin and Thomas, his associate, who carried his accordion files and his quiet intensity. The mediator was a retired family court judge named Margaret Holloway, who had the particular authority of a woman who had spent 30 years making decisions that mattered to the people in front of her and who had learned to make them without losing sight of the people. The proceedings were honest, I want to say that clearly. Laurel was honest about the estate. She was honest about the circumstances. She had already acknowledged what she had acknowledged at the kitchen table 7 months earlier, and she brought that same honesty into the mediation room. When Franklin presented the Ridge legal consulting and portfolio documentation, the room was quiet for a moment. Not the dramatic quiet of a surprise attack, the quiet of people absorbing information that fills in a picture they had not previously seen in its complete form. Laurel's attorney asked clarifying questions. Franklin answered them. The documentation supported every answer. Laurel looked at me at one point during the documentation review and said, "I did not know the scale of this." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have asked." I said, "Yes. But I should have told you. Both of those things are true." She nodded. We divided what needed to be divided. The marital assets were substantial, and the division was equitable, and the proceeding concluded without the kind of protracted conflict that makes lawyers rich and people miserable. My separate property remained mine. The marital estate was divided according to what each person had contributed and what Tennessee law required. I walked out of the mediation on a March morning and stood on Broadway, in the light that was cold and clear and honest in the way March light in Nashville tends to be, and I breathed for a long time. I want to tell you about what came after. Not the logistics, the house that was sold, the apartment I moved into in East Nashville, the conversations with my daughter that were the hardest conversations of my life, and that I navigated with the specific, terrified care of a man who understood that what he said to his 14-year-old daughter in those months would be part of her foundation for the rest of her life. I want to tell you about what I learned. What I learned was not about Laurel. What I learned was about the airport. Not the night of it, the pattern of it, the way I had been standing at arrival barriers for years, waiting for someone to come through doors and be who I needed them to be, and the way I had been picking people up, carrying their bags, warming the car, preparing the coffee, making the return easy in the specific, unglamorous, daily way of a person who believed that love was something you maintained through reliable presence, and that reliable presence would eventually generate the thing you needed in return. It does not always work that way. That was what the airport taught me. Not that love is unreliable, that love requires language as well as action, that the quiet building, the consistent showing up, the coffee in the airport and the dinner cooked and the plants watered and the porch light left on, all of it matters and none of it is sufficient if the two people doing it are not also regularly telling each other what they are building and why and what they need, and whether the thing they are building together is still the same thing each of them is trying to build. I had been a man who showed up. I had not always been a man who spoke. I had inherited my father's preference for the considered nod over the speech, and I had let that preference fill the spaces that should have been filled with words, and the spaces had filled instead with silence, and the silence had been available for other things to move into. That was my contribution to the failure. Not the failure of fidelity. That was Laurel's choice and her responsibility, and I am not distributing it. But the failure of the marriage, the slow, unmourned, unaddressed decay of the thing we had built together, that failure had two authors, and I was one of them. This is not a comfortable thing to understand about yourself. It is an important one. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I had a conversation with my daughter, Sophie, that I will carry for the rest of my life. She was 15 by then. She was living primarily with me, which had been her choice, made with the particular clarity of a teenager who is more honest than adults tend to find convenient. She came to my study one Sunday afternoon, the one in the East Nashville apartment that I had set up the same way I had always set up my workspaces, books organized, desk clear, the legal pad stacked on the left side and the coffee cup on the right. She sat in the reading chair across from my desk and pulled her knees up and looked at me in the way she looked at me when she was about to say something she had been preparing. She said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" I said, "Always." She said, "Do you think you and Mom could have fixed it before the airport if you had known earlier?" I sat with the question. I sat with it the way my mother would have sat with a question from a student who had just asked something that deserved a real answer. I said, "I think we could have tried. I think we would have had to be different kinds of people to make trying succeed. Your mother would have had to be someone who could stay when she wanted to leave, and I would have had to be someone who said the things I was thinking instead of assuming you could feel them. We were not quite those people, and I am not sure that is something you fix. I think sometimes it is just something you understand after the fact." She said, "Does it make you sad?" I said, "It makes me honest, which is sometimes the same as sad, but is not always." She said, "I think you are a really good dad." I looked at her. I looked at my daughter, who was 15 and navigating a broken family with a grace that exceeded anything I had managed at her age, and who had just offered me the most generous and uncomplicated thing anyone had said to me in a year. I said, "Thank you. That means more than you know." She said, "I know it does. That is why I said it." She went back to her room. I sat at my desk for a long time. I thought about language, about the things we say and the things we leave unsaid, and the gap between them in which marriages either live or die. I thought about airports and arrivals and the specific, irreversible nature of overheard words spoken in voices that were not performing anything because the speaker believed they were alone. I thought about the fact that the most honest conversation of my marriage had happened in a kitchen at 1 a.m, on a night when the performance was no longer available to either of us. And I thought about how many kitchens it might have been different in if we had arrived there on purpose instead of by accident. I thought about what I wanted the next chapter to look like, not in terms of another relationship. That was not the right question yet. In terms of who I intended to be in it, whether I would continue to be the man who showed up and held his tongue, and trusted that consistent presence would be understood, or whether I would learn, finally, and at the cost of a marriage, to say the thing when the thing needed saying. Whether I would learn that love is a language and languages require speaking. Ridge Legal Consulting continued to grow. I hired a second legal assistant in the fall. I took on an 8th client, a technology company in Atlanta that had been referred by one of my existing clients, and that needed the specific kind of intellectual property strategy that I had been building expertise in for 20 years. The work was good. The work had always been good. The work was the thing that had remained consistent and reliable through everything, the one room in the house where the lights always worked. I moved to a better apartment in the spring, one with a proper study and a kitchen with enough counter space to cook the way I like to cook, with room to spread out, multiple things in progress at once, the organized complexity of a meal that requires attention to several elements simultaneously, and that produces something better than the sum of its parts if you do not get impatient and try to rush any single element. My mother came to see the apartment in April. She walked through it with the evaluative attention of a woman who had been reading spaces the way she read texts for 50 years, looking for what the structure reveals about the person living in it. She stood in my study for a long time. She looked at the books and the legal pads and the coffee cup on the right side of the desk. She said, "You look like yourself in here." I said, "I feel like myself in here." She said, "That is the thing. When you were with Laurel, you looked like a version of yourself that was trying to be enough. This looks like someone who already knows he is enough." I said, "I think the airport helped with that." She said, "The airport helped with everything, even though it hurt. Sometimes the thing that hurts the most is the thing that makes you clearest." She sat in the reading chair. She asked me about Sophie. I told her Sophie was doing well, better than expected, with the honest, specific resilience of a young woman who had inherited her grandmother's relationship with truth and her grandfather's preference for action over explanation. My mother laughed. She said that sounded about right. We had coffee. We talked for 2 hours in the easy, unhurried way that we talked when there was nothing we needed to prove to each other. She left at 4 o'clock. I stood on the landing outside the apartment and watched her car pull out of the parking lot and felt, with the complete and uncomplicated simplicity of a man who has survived something and is still standing, grateful. I want to speak to you now. I want to speak to the person who recognized something in the airport arrivals hall. The person who has stood at a barrier with a bad cup of coffee and a surprise planned and heard something they were not ready for. The person who has driven home for 25 minutes in a car full of conversation that was not a conversation. The person who has sat at a kitchen table at 1 a.m. and let the truth expand until it filled all the rooms. I want to tell you several things, and I want to tell them simply because they are true, and because simple things told simply are more useful than complicated things told beautifully. The first thing is this. What you heard was real, not what it means about your future. Not what it means about what should happen next. Just that it was real. Acknowledge it. Do not manage it down to something more comfortable before you have let it be exactly the size it is. The second thing is this. The person you are in the moment after you hear something that destroys a structure you have been living inside is not the person you will be in a month or 6 months or a year. The moment is not the conclusion. It is the turning point. What you do with the turn determines the conclusion. The third thing is this. What you built during the marriage was real. The dinner cooked and the porch light left on, and the airport surprise planned, and the drive home made easier, and the plants watered, and the presents maintained, and the patience extended. All of it was real. The fact that the other person was somewhere else does not retroactively make your effort fiction. You showed up. You kept showing up. That is your character. And it belongs to you, and it will serve you in what comes next if you do not let the ending of this story persuade you that showing up was the wrong strategy. The showing up was not the wrong strategy. The strategy that was missing was the language, the words that go with the showing up, the sentences that make the presence legible, the honest, specific, regular conversations in which two people tell each other what they are building, and why and what they need, and whether they are still building the same thing. Those conversations are not romantic. They are not dramatic. They happen in kitchens and cars and on Sunday mornings, and they are uncomfortable because they require you to say things before you have processed them all the way down, and because the person you are saying them to might say something back that you were not ready to hear. Have them anyway. Have them before the airport. Have them at the table before the table becomes the place where the truth finally arrives, because there is nowhere else left for it to go. And if you are already past the airport, if the arrivals hall is already behind you and the kitchen table conversation is already history, and the divorce proceedings are either in progress or concluded, then hear this. You are not the story of what happened to you at the airport. You are the person who stood there, and who drove home, and who sat at the kitchen table and did not pretend, and who told the truth about what they heard in a voice that was not performing anything. You are the person who called a good attorney and showed up to every mediation, and produced complete documentation, and did not allow yourself to be reduced to the number that the other side assumed you were. You are the person who had the conversation with their daughter about whether things could have been fixed and who gave her the honest answer, instead of the comforting one, because you understood that she deserved honesty more than she deserved comfort. You are the person who moved to a new apartment and set up the study the same way it has always been set up, because some things about you do not change because of what someone else did, and those things are the most important things, and they are yours. Tonight, find the room in your home where you are most yourself, the study with the legal pads and the coffee cup on the right, the workshop where the wood is, the kitchen with the counter space, the garden in the backyard with the raised beds you built yourself on a weekend in October. Sit in it, not to process anything, not to plan anything, just to be in the room where you are most fully who you are, where the lights work, where the work is good, where the version of you that is not performing anything for anyone lives. That version of you survived the airport. That version of you sat at the kitchen table and told the truth. That version of you showed up for your daughter every day of the hardest year and will keep showing up for every year after. That version of you is the real one. The one that was there before the marriage and is still here after it. The one that my mother recognized in the study in the East Nashville apartment on an April afternoon when she said, "You look like yourself in here." That is the one. That is who you are. The airport was not the end of your story. It was the moment the story got honest. And honest stories, told by people who are willing to sit in the kitchen at 1 in the morning and say what they actually heard, those stories do not end with an airport. They begin there, with a cup of bad coffee, and the automatic doors, and the particular clarifying, completely honest light of 11:30 at night, and the decision to stop performing and start living in the full, complicated, language-requiring, presence-demanding reality of who you actually are. That decision is available to you right now, not tomorrow. Right now. Make it.